Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Industry Insights. I am your host, Leah Troscianecki, and I am joined for a second week in a row by my good friend, Ray Umerley from our Covert team by Veeam. Ray, thank you again so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
I am as well. So for those who didn't join us in the last episode, the recording of that is available on whatever platform you like to watch these on. So X, Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn, which is typically where I watch our shows. But we last week talked about incident response. And we had a lot of action. There was a lot of folks in the chat commenting on how important it is for our traditional IT community to be up to date on the latest trends and best practices around incident response, because more and more we are seeing the need for IT teams and security teams to come together to be able to stop these bad actors in their tracks and be ready when you can't. And that's actually something we're going to talk a bit about on today's show, how important it is to be on the offensive and the defensive, ready for everything, and some of these myths that we typically hear in the incident response space. So on last week's episode, we introduced some of the top phases of incident response, which starts all with detection. In the future episodes, we're going to talk a bit more about containment, eradication, recovery, and also what you do afterwards, what that post-mortem might look like. So we'll cover the full life cycle of incident response in these future episodes. But on today's show in particular, we're going to be talking all things detection. And this is, of course, the really fun sport of it all, if you can think of it that way. This is also the nail-biting, terrifying parts of all of this. So one of the things that the Veeam team is so proud of this year is that we were able to partner with the Covert team. Covert is, of course, one of the leading vendors in the incident response space. And one of the unique value adds that they bring to market is something called a TTP analysis, tactics, techniques, and processes. So it's super important that we continue to bring these TTP analysis into our IT community, because what they're doing is aggregating data across all of the cases that they see and trying to pull that information together for insights that keep us up on the latest trends. You guys know, as a Veeam team, we're very passionate about research, and this just brings some of the speed element to that research arm. So a lot of the data we're going to be looking at is actually fresh off the presses from the Q3 TTP analysis. So you guys are getting some of that early access information that many of our customers who are now on TTP contracts get to experience in full. But with that, I think, Ray, it's a good time to bring you in and talk a bit about some of the top threat actors that you guys saw in the Q3 report. And we teased this a little bit in our intro show last week, but we wanted to start off at the top of the call talking more about these threat actors, especially because a lot of these groups are brand new as of this year, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to be important to look at, one, all this is derived from the Covert case data, first party information. We're not commingling with any other sources, but just looking at the overall movement of threat actors from quarter to quarter. So what do I mean by that? If you look at our top threat actor here, Akira, fifth consecutive quarter that they've been in the lead in terms of overall cases. This is a quantity over quality group. They like to focus on a lot of small and medium enterprises. They love to use things like valid accounts from the dark web, leveraging that against single factor authentication on the VPNs. But they've been at the top of that list for 5 consecutive quarters, but they held on by a thread in Q3. And the two that are nipping at the heels, Ransom Hub and Fog, these groups have only been on the horizon for 8 months and 5 months respectively, and they've charged into the top 3. Very voluminous in terms of their attacks. Ransom Hub has likely absorbed a lot of different affiliates from some of these displaced or disrupted groups like Black Hat that many people have heard about. Fog's had a very short lifespan, but they clearly come from some sort of ransomware background. They definitely have experience here. And then we also have these lone wolves, these independent actors. And one of the things that we've talked about, and we highlighted a little bit previously on the last one, is the barrier of entry to cyber extortion, ransomware attacks in general is incredibly low. There are more SKUs in your average dark web marketplace than your Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever your big box home improvement store is, like 40,000 SKUs of exploit kits and credentials. Very easy to get into this space. But one of the things we're going to talk about is despite all these new groups and movements, when we get into detection, there's a lot of overlapping patterns and signatures and playbooks and things to kind of look for, regardless of the individual group, that can help to position yourself better in terms of response.
It sounds like sometimes there is that kind of new wave threat actor, that next great threat. But then a lot of this is some of the basic same tactics that we've been seeing in these scary movies for a long time. It's still going to be the masked villain and the werewolf and some of these common tropes that we've seen. Of course, I had to throw in some Halloween references, guys. It is the season. But I think that's a little bit comforting, right? This idea that we have seen the tactics that they've taken many times over, and we know how to detect them. We know what to do about them. So I think that's why it's so great to have this TTP analysis showing so many different attack vectors. So we'll go ahead and flip that to the next slide there and just show you guys again how, these top attack vectors are nothing new. It's different groups and it may be different things that they're doing, but the categories, those tactics, that big pie in the sky, it's a lot of the same stuff. Ray, before I have you provide some color commentary on that, I do just want to go ahead and invite folks in the chat to let us know what some of those common attack vectors you typically see if you are in touch with your security teams and feel like you know that information well. Of course, it's always hard to share information publicly about any kind of ransomware attacks you may or may not have experienced, so feel free to anonymize. But I think it's really good for us to stay together as a community. If you don't want to let us know what that recent attack vector was, let us know where you're calling in from. We're going to put up a map in a little bit. For those who haven't joined us before, we love to kind of talk about this community element and show just how many folks are calling in from all these different states and countries around the world. So let us know in the chat where you're calling in from, and we'll put up that map in a little bit. But Ray, back to basics here, right? Talking about some of these tactics that we've been seeing for a long time. There is some trends here, though, that I'm sure you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the frustrating part as a security professional. I've been doing this for 25 years, back when we just worried about website defacement and so forth. But it's still the same things that we're continuing to see on that uphill challenge of kind of pushing the rope. It's the phishing the phishing vulnerabilities, the behavioral aspects of that get taken advantage of. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a second. The remote access capabilities, the fact that we have so many things exposed on the endpoint and we still struggle with deployment of basic blocking and tackling like multi-factor authentication or even just strong password hygiene. And of course, software vulnerabilities. But as we look at the chart from Q3, and you can see different trending here that are happening, the reality is phishing surpassed remote access compromise. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but phishing is a technically mixed vector. We have to be careful not to wrap ourselves around phishing as email only, right? We hammer our organizations multiple times a month with phishing awareness campaigns. Don't click on this, don't click on that. But the reality is we see a lot of different variations on phishing that also combine elements of social engineering. We have groups like Silent Ransomware that use tried and true callback phishing schemes. So what they do is they send an invoice for some amount for some new license subscription renewal. If this is an error, give us a call. We'll be happy to sort this out. Anybody who calls in, they're often then coerced into downloading some sort of remote assistant. They get access to the machine, and they almost immediately move to extortion at that scale. We also have actors such as Keelan. Now, this is a group that has some suspected connections maybe with the newly resurrected Scattered Spider, but they've been using tactics like search engine optimization poisoning. What does that mean? Well, how many times have you gone off to Google or to Edge or whatnot looking for a tool or a template or something that you use in your day-to-day work? Many times we're presented first with those sponsored ads before we get to the others. They'll actually sponsored ads that take you to malicious sites with malicious software and use that for initial access. And then on top of that, phishing campaigns where you actually have threat actors calling individual employees directly, oftentimes on their mobile numbers, spoofed numbers being the source of the calls themselves, and coercing them into going into VPN websites or going into an MFA appearing website to put in their multi-factor authentication credentials and then taking that and leveraging that for access to the environment. So a lot of different vectors in phishing, but still very prominently exposed there because a lot of it depends on human behavior. And then even when you look at remote access dropping, I mentioned single factor authentication, that's still a common component of those phishing attacks then becoming reality because they'll often use that against those remote access points to then get into the environment.
Yeah, I think that social engineering piece is so important, especially as it presents in different tactics. One of my favorite ransomware attacks to talk about is the MGM hack from a while back. The idea that somebody was able to call into, well, let me roll this back. They looked at LinkedIn, identified somebody who would have high enough access rights within the IT organization to successfully infiltrate. They called into support, pretending to be that person, and asked support to send in updated login credentials to a different email address. And the person did it. That process piece is so important. Once they were able to gain access, they infiltrated in many different places. So that concept of multiple vectors is really important to acknowledge, because truly that NGM hack was chaos personified. But Ray, I know one of the big areas that was targeted was VMware ESXi hosts. And I think on our last slide, you had wanted to talk about that as well, this idea that VMware ESXi hosts are popping up more and more. It's not just about Microsoft vulnerabilities.
No, that's a great point, and it was something, an omission from the last one, but it's worth calling out. So ransomware has not been a Microsoft-specific problem alone for a very long period of time. Most ransomware actors recognize that, one, Microsoft has a huge install base, so Microsoft Windows and compiled variants for that are always going to be prevalent. But they've also recognized that we've moved a lot of our infrastructure to virtualization. And VMware ESXi commonly consumed by a lot of organizations for that purpose. And the challenge with that is multifaceted because, one, the impact. If you take down one host or a cluster of VMware ESXi hosts, you're going to impact multiple applications, databases, and by the way, probably some for IT and network and security tools as well that may be running on that. They often also aren't configured the best way, because sometimes our administrators have to now absorb this technology. Maybe they haven't been trained properly on it. They are loosely configured, and they fall into that unmanaged bucket where we don't have the security tooling and capabilities that we have on these other operating systems. There is no EDR for ESXi, for example. And all that plays into a threat actor's hands. And ESXi, especially within the last 18 months, has been just as prevalent, if not more so, in many of our cases for ransomware encryption attacks, where we actually see threat actors ignore Windows and go straight for those environments for maximal impact.
Wanted to make sure that the folks on this live stream especially heard that message, because of course Veeam and the VMware community are technically a Venn diagram, although at this point they're pretty much circles overlapping. So I think it's really important that everybody hears that. Speaking of community, let's go ahead and pause real quick from the content and put up that map, because we wanted to thank you all so much for joining us from all around the world. And if you are wanting to get in on the action, let us know in the chat where you're calling in from. I am actually traveling this week. Normally, I am in Ohio with Jeffrey, our video mastermind for the show. But I'm actually in Colorado this week visiting friends. So I'm joining you guys from further west than normal. We also have production in Texas. Ray is, of course, in Connecticut. And then we have some audience members joining us from Florida as well. So thank you so much for being with us on today's show. If we pop over to the next region, we have Denmark, Italy, and Ireland. Thank you all so much for joining us. I can't wait to visit you all soon. Over in South America, we have Argentina. Thank you so much for joining us. And then if we go ahead and flip over one more time, we also have Morocco, which is actually a place that my brother and sister-in-law love and have been to several times. So thank you so much for joining. I know it is probably quite late for you all in Morocco. We'll take another look at the chat later on, so let us know where you're calling in from. But let's go ahead and jump back into the content and specifically talk about this idea of compounding failures in the kill chain. Let's say, for example, we've started with that phishing attack, especially since that's coming up in the trend analysis. It doesn't really just tell the story if we're talking about a phishing email, right, Ray? There's so much more to it.
There is, and I'm going to kind of break this down, but there's a mythology that has started to be woven into a lot of cybersecurity, and this is going to be contentious. It's going to make some CISOs and other security professionals uncomfortable. But an adage started up years ago that attackers only have to be right once, but us defenders have to be right all the time. Now, honestly, that's heavily flawed. And again, I've been doing this for 25 plus years because it oversimplifies the dynamics of cybersecurity defense. It actually creates a false sense of inevitability around these breaches themselves, because security is not a single all or nothing event. And we're going to talk about kind of these compounding failures, but this is where the importance of things like defense in depth, detection, response, and so forth all become very important. And to illuminate this, before I get into more detail on that, it's not just that malicious phishing email. If we look at the next stage, it's the fact that it got through our filters. It got delivered to its intended target. Many of these things should never be delivered to, say, our C-suite executives or people on our legal team or finance or IT and so forth. For whatever reason, our security awareness training didn't resonate. It didn't click pun intended. So the person hit the link, they downloaded the attachment, maybe it was very well crafted. And by the way, large language models, OpenAI, these things are getting easier and easier to compose, very hard to detect. And then maybe there was malicious software and our EDR or our endpoint detection or antivirus didn't pick up on that. And now our threat actor has initial foothold in our environment. And they'll start to then poke holes into all the little gaps in our defenses. Did we really have multi-factor authentication deployed everywhere we needed to be? Are we overly permissive about what our accounts and our administrators can do and where they do it? Maybe we allow every application be downloaded from the internet to just be installed. Do we have any control on that? A little bit of a trivia point for many people. Threat actors don't come in that initial phishing email with a whole backpack full of tools. Once they get into the environment, they often then take time to then download and start to collect their tools and put them into play in addition to living off the land techniques. But then we get deeper in. We've talked about these things time over time. Privileged access management, segmentation of our network to minimize that radius and blast. Do we have anti-tampering on our endpoint detection and response? Because our threat actors recognize, much like we do, this is often our last clear chance of defense, and they will do what they can to take advantage of that. And then we have the actual execution of encryption. Now, when those encryption events occur, clean recoverable backups, always the primary key. You are in control of your narrative. It's going to be much faster and safer than trying to decrypt. And by the way, decryption is a slow process. We'll talk about more of that in the recovery episode. But again, backups are going to be critical. But as we go through this, a lot of different opportunities here, not only for the threat actor, but also for us, because many of these activities, as you work through this, there is a continuous attack cost associated with this. Attackers have to retain a sustained effort. This isn't a one-time win. They don't have to be right only once, but that also gives us opportunity to identify when this is happening, detect their behaviors, and hopefully thwart them before they get to that impactful event.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why it's so important to have that onslaught strategy. You can't necessarily have too many ways that you are focusing on detection. There is, of course, some best practices around analyzing those signals, figuring out when you escalate and when you act. We're going to talk about those best practices at the end of today's episode. But I think the idea here is there isn't just one magical elixir that can solve all the world's problems. And for us at Veeam, that's something that we're trying to adopt as well. The Covert team has done an amazing job of bringing so much knowledge and awareness and best practices into the Veeam practice. And on the flip side of that, as you all know, especially if you're a longtime Veeam backup and replication users, you've seen a lot of security-based enhancements in our solutions. And in particular, you've likely heard a lot of noise about YARA rules and integrations with different security vendors. We're actually going to talk a bit about that in the next episode. So if you want to learn more about Veeam's various security ecosystem integrations, stay tuned for that next episode, because boy, do we have a jam-packed show for you guys. But something that Ray and I really wanted to highlight that's a little bit different and unique is this idea of being defensive and detecting versus being more offensive, proactive, doing some of this threat hunting. And Veeam has opportunities for both. So if you think that these practices are just your security team's job and you're sitting back pretty thinking, gosh, I'm glad I don't have to understand this or deal with it, well, I think the industry is changing quite a bit, and Veeam really wants to be on the leading edge of that. So let's actually flip to the next slide and talk a bit about why we think that's so important. In particular, we have, again, a really healthy research arm. And as we do this Ransomware Trends Report, we are analyzing customers, not just of Veeam, but of many other backup vendors, and asking a variety of questions. In particular, we're asking, how often is the backup infrastructure attacked, and how often is it successfully infiltrated? And we are finding that 96% of the time that there is a ransomware attack, there is some kind of attempt on the backup infrastructure. As Ray said, if you are going to stop that kill chain, that last line of defense is a clear recovery. If you can kill the backups, if you can tamper with, delete, encrypt, whatever those backups, then you may not have a successful kill chain, and they're able to have you in a corner ready to do what they want with you. So it's really important that we understand that backup is a critical part of that attack surface. It's not just the rescue. And it's really important that we recognize just how often it is that these are successfully infiltrated. So looking at Veeam's both proactive and reactive techniques is a really great way that you all as a Veeam community can bring some of these best practices and value add to your own security teams, because that's really where IT and security can come together. Ray, anything you want to add on this piece here?
I think two important points. One, when we talk about defensive versus offensive, just for the sake of the audience, in case you're not aware, offensive doesn't mean going off and attacking the bad guys, as much as we would love to do that. But those defensive techniques are what we often rely on. There's those technology, there's alerting, all those things that happen across our environment to try to detect and contain. The offensive, though, is just as important, as Leah mentioned, because the reality is none of these things happen in isolation. If we go back to that compounding failures, what are those patterns? What are those tactics, techniques, and procedures? And how can we maybe mirror those or think outside of the box in the context of our specific environment? What's important to us? So if we know they're going after the backup infrastructure, let's see if there's new and novel ways that we ourselves can find ways to attack that and maybe cut that off before a threat actor can. And then to the point about the recovery aspect, 2/3 year to date, and this kind of goes kind of across the COPR information, 2/3 of organizations that fall into that payment to a threat actor often do so because they have no backups or a invalid recovery path or something else that's keeping them from getting their business up and running again.
All the more reason to really think about coverage when it comes to backup, right? You can't just have special proprietary or built-in tools for each one of the workloads. You can't just think about your Microsoft environment. It really needs to be something that's much more comprehensive in order to increase that confidence interval in the risk mitigation of all of this. Because as you saw from that kill chain, there are many ways that you can mitigate that risk. It is not dire, be all end all if the phishing attack is successful. And we actually had a great comment from Patrick in the chat. He was saying that he's oftentimes seeing email, text, phone call, hasn't gotten the knock on the door yet, but I think we can all expect that kind of thing happening. So Ray, I want to flip to the next slide here and talk a bit about how someone could recognize ransomware. And again, our audience is likely not on the security team, so they probably don't eat, sleep, and breathe this every day. I think this is a great opportunity to do some knowledge sharing between the two disciplines.
Absolutely. And hopefully nobody eats, sleep, and breathes this other than the people working on the incident response front lines. This is not a meal that you want to consume on a regular basis. But as we look at this, there's a couple different ways to identify ransomware early in that detection process. So this assumes now that a threat actor has gotten to that point that could actually try to execute this payload. But one of the things that might be obvious and maybe not is files that won't open. Now, it is important to note, though, this doesn't necessarily indicate encryption. We've seen examples where a threat actor has literally just changed the extensions from .doc, .xls, or .pdf to some sort of random string. And guess what happens? Your programs and your operating system don't know what to do with that any longer. So that doesn't necessarily indicate encryption, but it could be a strong start. Then we have things like splash screens blocking access. Now, this is oftentimes like whole disk encryption. So we'll see where maybe BitLocker, which is often used to encrypt all the different hard drives of all the different Microsoft systems, could be compromised by the threat actor. Passwords changed, and now you're locked out of those hosts. We also see this as smaller scale attacks where they might bring in their own proprietary tooling. And we've seen this with a lot of VMware ESXi now, not with encryption per se, but with changing credentials and locking the administrators out of those underlying hosts, which often means you have to reinstall or re-image to get access again to that unless you're going to pay for a password. Additional file extensions, almost every ransomware out there has some nuance to it in terms of the extensions that it'll add. Some are random strings, some are things like hard to decrypt. Black Hat had meow because they were cats. I don't know if they dressed like that for Halloween, but it would seem appropriate. But again, if you're seeing a massive amount of these extensions being added to files on different systems, probably a strong indicator some sort of encryption is running, and we should immediately move to our containment protocols, which we'll discuss in a future episode. And then the ransom note. Now, ransom notes come in various forms, but the two things I'd like to highlight here is one, a lot of the ransom notes in an encryption attack are going to be system generated. So that executable itself will actually drop those notes on the desktop or in the folders or whatever when it completes its run. That could mean that if your endpoint detection and response tools and other things stop that from happening, you may not actually get a note. So important to consider what would that process look like, maybe to have your forensics team restore this in a sandbox, see if they could actually generate a note there, but also emails. So particularly for exfiltration, but also follow-ups from many of our threat actors if they don't get initial response. Those will come in via email, but many of them are going to be Proton Mail, dark web, onion accounts, those kind of things. Guess what? We usually don't allow those to get to our C-suite, let alone anybody else in our organization. So check those email quarantines on a regular basis and really just make that part of your ongoing process, because you don't want to hear about a data exfiltration attack, for example, when it shows up on a leak site, if you had an opportunity to maybe get ahead of that because the threat actor was trying to communicate with you.
Fantastic. Hopefully everybody in the audience feels like they're kind of up-leveling their game a little bit here. And we're going to leave you guys with some best practices. But before we get to that, I want to go ahead and throw up the map one more time. So you guys get the sneak peek here, but let's take it away and put that map up. Because again, this is really all about the community. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We've gone ahead and added our friends up north in Canada. Thank you for joining us, as well as someone even further on the West Coast than me in California. Thank you so much for joining us early in the morning. If we flip over to Europe, we've added the Netherlands as well. And then if we flip over again, I think still have Brazil showing on the South America map. Let's go ahead and flip again. And we've actually added some folks in Egypt and Zimbabwe. So as we were seeing those pop up in the chat, we were all saying, yeah, this is awesome, adding some new countries to the mix. And then, of course, if we flip over one more time, we actually have someone joining us from Malaysia. So thank you so much for joining us. I am sure it is quite late for you all there. Hopefully this has been really useful to you all. And again, the replays will be available on all the platforms that you watch these shows on, along with our future episodes. So to tease some of that a little bit via these best practices, I want to contextualize for everybody something that's really important to the Veeam team. We are spending a lot of time talking about the fact that it's not just about the tech. It is about people, process, and tech aligning together. And in particular, as myself and Ray and others on the Veeam team who have been preparing this series for you guys, we've talked a lot about speed as kind of that central point between people, process, and tech. The idea of having lots of different signals integrating together and helping you triage that. We're going to talk about that on the next show. This idea that we're trying to bring some of the processes in, bring teams together from disparate groups, that's super important. So Ray, go ahead and take us home with some of these best practices that are really important around that people, process, and tech concept.
Absolutely. So we'll start off with contextualizing security alerts. So what does that mean? This is where we can't solely rely on just those detective technologies. So if we're seeing alerts that are being generated, potentially from malware or maybe something we know might be associated with a threat actor, how do we react to that and how quickly do we react? Because a workstation event, somebody's laptop, is very different than if that same thing occurs on an Active Directory domain controller or a backup application server. So how do we apply context to this to make sure we respond appropriately? We talked about those early ransomware identifications. What are those infection indicators to look for? And what's the protocols for handling that? How quickly do we then enact our ransomware playbooks? Maybe we have a whole bunch of containment actions for that, but also how do we handle those artifacts? Because the reality is those ransom notes often will have key information associated with the organization that, if leaked beyond, could not only lead to an unauthorized disclosure of the event, but also potentially people invading the negotiations, the chats, and so forth, and putting your organization at risk. Think about that process to look at those email domains. We talked about that on that previous slide. And then, of course, what's the engagement model if you do uncover one of these email threats or even the ransom note itself? The clear triggers for the incident response, activation, and escalation. Leah mentioned speed. Too many organizations underestimate how fast you need to move at the onset and overestimate their capability to do so. So when we look at that, one thing is to make sure that we have clear triggers for the activation, but also when we talked about this in the last episode, we'll talk about it again, that preparation, that adage of organizations don't rise to the occasion, they fall to their level of preparation. The way you build speed is to exercise and make sure those people, processes, and technologies are aligned as the course of those exercises. And you want to do that in times of peace, so you can avoid that in times of cyber war. And then finally, empowering those experts, not only the internal experts who can make those quick decisions when necessary to say, listen, I need to shut off this segment of the network. I need to isolate our backups, whatever I need to do. But also, who are those third parties that you're going to call in, bring into play to help support that all the way through from that containment eradication all the way through that recovery?
Fantastic. Well, hopefully everybody found a lot of value in these best practices. We recommend that you guys take this back to your team, talk more about them, think about those tabletop exercises. And of course, let the Veeam team know how we can help with those kinds of activities, because it really takes a village. It takes all of us staying ahead of the latest and greatest information and all these trends and these new bad actors and, those TTP reports. We're going to keep talking about those as a Veeam team. But with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us on this episode. Next week, Ray and I will be back again, and we'll be talking a bit more about the ecosystem that Veeam is spending a lot of time trying to integrate with so you can pull together people, process, and tech. But before that, on Thursday, we have Tech Bites. Rick Vanover, our good friend, is going to be joining a member of the Atto technology team to talk all about virtualization and tape. So some of that traditional bread and butter that Veeam is known for. Thank you all so much for joining us on this week's episode. We look forward to joining you on the next one.